So, something that often gets overlooked in a lot of American history textbooks is the Desert War, which originally happened due to the Italian invasion of North Africa in the Second World War in the early 1940s. And essentially, what happened was that the British went in response to the Italian invasion. They basically beat back the Italians, and then the Germans intervened in order for them to not collapse, in order for them not to just get wrecked entirely and lose that sphere of influence. However, it wasn't until the US entered the Second World War with Operation Torch that the theater would be closed. And that's the reason why I wanted to cover this conflict via the British 8th Army. It was a composite army made up from all types of units from the empires, from Punjabs to Sikhs to Kiwis to Australians to Highlanders and Polish in exile troops to your regular British Tommies. And really, while colonialism was bad, it still saved the world. And that's something that we often overlook whenever we cover the Second World War, and we usually focus on either the European front or we focus on the Pacific in a very US-centric perspective as well. Or if you get the occasional German perspective, you have that too. So I decided to paint up the 41st Highlander Division and a division of Sikhs for my British 8th Army. I painted up two different test models. One was for the Highlanders and one was for the Sikhs. And I actually learned a lot about just what I wanted to do and the mistakes that I made. In particular, I made the mistake of painting up the skin into a point where it looked too pale and it really didn't mesh well when everything else was in place. Something that I would self-correct for both the Highlanders and the Sikhs whenever I move forward with the rest of my guys. The initial color scheme I got was from this blog by Stephen Belgin, which included several methods, the various ways to paint up the uniforms, and in the end, I actually didn't go with most of that. But the final paint scheme came from Beast of War, because the uniform recipe for the entirety of the army, and then it also included the skin recipe for the Sikhs. And to be honest with you, one, I've never been good at painting skin, and I really did need a point of reference. I also took a shortcut by taking some advice from the article, and instead of just going from a straight black or white, I primed it with skeleton bone, which is a khaki color from Army Painter. And then after that, I did a zenithal highlight for most of my guys, which was supposed to reflect just the heat of the desert sun, which North Africa is mainly desert, so it wasn't too far off the mark. However, this was also a mistake in some points, because while you can't really see it from the camera angle, it was hard to differentiate between the hues when using Iraqi sand and khaki, because they are very close tonally in the hues. And that's something that we often don't think about. Even whenever you prime over white, even with a very off-white color, you'll usually find it to be at least somewhat. It will differentiate for the most part between the base coat and the primer. The only other time I can think about this is like if you use a very heavy charcoal gray on top of a black primer or a gray black primer. That's the only other time I could see this being an issue, which has been an issue for me in the past as well. And actually, this isn't the entirety of my troubles as well. In all honesty, historicals, while they are a really nice and niche genre, there are some distinct challenges that you get from getting into this side of the miniature wargaming hobby. One of them is that usually you're going to be dealing with horde armies, as in you will paint 30 plus infantry just for a basic quote-unquote army, or you will paint 30 infantry for a basic army, which the thing about that is though is that even though it is only 3.5 boxes of Space Marines, that's just the beginning of it all. Like, you're going to probably have to paint up more, and honestly, it's more like painting up an entire guard army, but every army for bold action is in essence a guard army. Some of them are even more numerous, like the Soviets, which have special rules because the Soviets are represented by having 12-man squads as their basic size for strength, which means that you're going to be painting up a lot more miniatures, and so space becomes an issue. And even though you might say, oh well, these are simpler sculpts, so there's less detail, so there's less to worry about, that is true. However, with these guys, even though there's a lot less detail on them, they come with their own issues. Like, they have little suspenders, they have the gaiters, they have their boots, they have, you know, all the folds and ripples on the clothing. And so if you really wanted to, you could go all out and decide to spend as much time as you do on your 40k armies. And at the same time, that's actually one of the beauties of this hobby, is that you realize maybe spending, 20 hours on a box of Space Marines might not be the best idea. Sometimes, if you can just do a basic paint job and maybe do a couple highlights here and there, that's fine. That's no one's really going to notice in the blob 5 feet away. I mean, the thing about it is that we as a community often over-obsess, and recently, and I'm not trying to snub these guys, but Artis Opus had a video recently where they basically were like, oh yeah, look at all these amazingly painted quote-unquote tournament armies, and the point was to show how much craft and care people put into their armies, which is great. On the other hand, it's not necessary, and for people who are just getting into the hobby, it can be fairly intimidating. It's like, you're beginning to draw basic objects, you're beginning to, understand perspective and form and construction, and then somebody knocks on your door and they're like, look at this really cool, artwork that has a lot of shading and contour lines and is messing with your perspective, and it's like, okay, well, that's cool, but that's not going to help me in my journey right now. In fact, it's probably going to hinder me, because it's basically going to hinder me because the message becomes, oh no, look at that guy over there, I can't compete with that guy, instead of saying, okay, even though you're not as good as that person right now, you can and will grow over time to be better, and to be a better hobbyist, and to be a better overall person. In all honesty, the other thing though is that while I only show the painting of 4 miniatures for this video, the reason why I did that is because it was really, really draining to essentially batch paint 36 guys, because it usually took an hour for 36 guys to go through and to get one coat of paint. The reason why I did that though is because I knew that by the time whenever I got done with my last model of the batch, the first one that I had started on would be done drying. So the idea was that the cycle just begins anew. And I wouldn't bump into the issue of waiting forever for the paint to dry, because that can be an issue where one decides to go and they have one or two models and it takes 15 minutes before the paint dries, and you basically get bogged down. But also that means that I can hit all the details then and there and not worry about it later. Something also I discovered is that you do need to have a base layer of black or a dark color on your metallic bits if you put metallic paint on them. You might say, oh, that's normal, that's to be expected, but I wanted to experiment. Basically put a metallic paint on white and see where things went. The result was, it didn't turn out that well. It was tacky, sticky, and it didn't really shine through. I needed at least a coat of black paint on there, usually two. And you might say, well, one, 2 layers of paint. 2 thin coats is always the recommended amount to put on before you go into the next color. And I would say yes. However, I'm really wanting to just push that aside and see if I can get away with one thin layer of paint on an extremely opaque color, because I'm trying to figure out a way to cut time out. And the thing is that the most challenging part about this though was the skin, because after washing it, I was wondering how to get the contrast. Eventually, I figured it out, but it was too late. And that was that if I had gone and recess shade the crevices of muscles, that really would have made things pop out. However, I decided against it because I was under a time constraint to get all of this done. These miniatures have been sitting in my to-do list since January of this year, and I initially started the project and I started priming out in the cold because why not? And that really wasn't happening. And so I decided to just put it on hold. Then the school year got underway. Then I had a summer job outside of town. And then after I got back home, I realized that this needed to happen or it wasn't going to happen. And so in the end, this project took me around 6 hours to complete over the course of 2 weeks, because what would happen is that I was trying to manage between class, hobby time, and other responsibilities that I have and still do. However, I also learned that I also challenged myself to do more of this project, to not just simply stay in my comfort zone. And so I decided that I was going to edge highlight. And I was going to edge highlight the backpacks and the bedrolls, plus the creases where they came to a point. And in the end, it worked. It wasn't just something that I didn't do because it was too hard. I decided to go and to just try it. And you might say, oh well, that's normal. But the first time I tried highlighting anything, I just dropped the ball. And in the end, I said for 2 years, I'm going to avoid edge highlighting. Or highlighting in general, I don't care. And for a while that worked. But then it came to the point where I was tired of just having my models look meh overall. And so I decided, why not? I'm going to highlight my various parts, and I just want to see where it leads me. And honestly, it was nice because it led some visual distinction in my models from one another, because even though they're all edge highlighted in the same areas, it's less of a blob because of the visual contrast that makes everything stick out just a little bit more. Now, the other part, and the more challenging part of all of this, was whenever I was painting up the support weapons and vehicles. And in part, that was just because trying to get my hand to handle the support weapons and the crew were just a bit more challenging to do overall. All of these are the support weapons and vehicles are on bases the size of a Redemptor Dreadnought, and that's a 40 millimeter base, and I don't have a hobby holder for a 40 millimeter base, which means that I'm having to grasp it in an open palm position with my fingers, which can be hard to capture on camera, especially with my setup, because I literally have one camera and I have essentially 2 tripods. But really, I use one tripod because one's made for capturing video in an isometric view, and the other one's a regular general purpose tripod. And you might say, well, that shouldn't be too hard, but whenever you have to go and do all of it, it is kind of it is a task. It is something that I'm learning to do that's just going to be a bit more of a challenge. But as I progress in all aspects of this hobby, I also progress in the development of my skills. And that's something that you shouldn't despair about, is because it takes a long time for you just to develop these skills, for you to say, hey, this isn't impossible. That's something that's just out of my reach, or only if I dedicate, an insane amount of time to, that I can get good at. The truth is that that's not the case. Really, what it is that we just have to go and to apply ourselves a little bit more and not give up. Probably, though, the easiest of these to paint were the artillery pieces, because they are very geometric in their designs. The crews aren't glued to the bases. They aren't expected to be glued to the bases like the medium machine gun and the medium mortar. And also the fact of the matter that there's a lot less in the terms of details. You mainly just have to hit the highlights and get the recesses for whenever you wash and highlight things. On that note, something that I did try on all of my guys was I decided to go and try to mess with some washes. So I had 2 main ways of washing all of these miniatures: an Army Painter soft tone with some quick shade medium mixed in, or it was Agrax Earthshade. And what I learned is that the Agrax Earthshade gave a brown tone to most of my miniatures, and it was usually a stronger tone as well. But what was interesting about the strong tone was that it basically tinted the miniatures instead of just giving it a warm brown tone overall, which was kind of interesting because I was determined to think it would have simply been a brown wash as well, because the dropper bottle that comes in is a fairly like greenish brown wash. And the thing about it is that before this, I had only used really Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil to shade and wash things. Decided to go and use the soft tone. The other thing about it is that the soft tone is a lot thicker than the washes than the shades from GW, and so it needed to be thinned down no matter what. The only thing that really the quick shade medium does is that it basically has less overall pigment in the wash itself. So it's essentially the same deal that you would get using Lamian medium or the contrast medium from Citadel in the various paints. But it also means that it's another tool in my belt now that I didn't have access to beforehand. However, there was a mistake that I made, And it happened after all of the painting had been done. I was about to record what everything looked on the dioramas, and it was going to be fine. But then I accidentally dropped the medium mortar. What happened is that the actual tube for the mortar broke off and decided to get lost underneath my hobby desk. Something that I have not recovered so far, even though I probably could, just because of the situation in the room that I do hobby in and record in. Right now, that's not really a feasible option. So I screwed up pretty hard. And on the other hand, even though I hadn't varnished my models, none of the paint chipped, and none of the other miniatures came off. And probably it was because since the medium mortar was in the center of everything, in the center of the base, it was a lot easier for it to come off like that. And as mentioned previously, even though this took 6 hours in real time, what really killed me for this project was the fact of it was basically real life, because of all my other responsibilities. Right now, this is strictly a side project. I have, at the last time of checking my subscriber count, 25 subs. My last video has around the amount of subscribers I do have. I'm pretty sure that not every subscriber that I have has actually seen all of my videos, or seen that video in particular. But at the same time, a big reason I hear for people not being able to finish their armies is the fact that, they have other responsibilities, that they're just super busy. And I'm right now a full-time student. I'm graduating at the end of December, and so I'm also currently searching for a job. And it's one of those things of, if you really want to do something, make it a priority. Don't just push it off and say, I'll do it later. An hour spent, and that's the thing, especially in historicals, the base coats are usually what you want to get done, not initially, but it's the most pressing thing, because after the base coats are done, you just need to wash it. And then after you wash it, you can just give a couple highlights and you're done. And the thing is that these are 28mm miniatures, so they're not going to have a huge amount of paint to put on to an individual miniature. Sure, it's something that you have to manage overall, but at the same time, if I had spent 1 hour a night for 6 days, I would have been able to complete the entirety of this army within that time span. and had more than enough time to spare. And probably I could have spent an hour for 7 days out of the week and gotten the same result. I mean, the only other thing that I have to add on to that part, though, is that my recording equipment wasn't running the entire time because battery life and memory space are at a premium, so not everything got recorded, but not everything does get recorded for my purposes because that's just not how I roll. The other thing that really kept me motivated is that I like this historical time period, and eventually I'm going to do an Africa or army, and I'm going to do probably an Italian army. Well, because I want my British 8th Army guys to have some oppositions, and maybe I can get a friend or two to actually play some bold action with me too. Who knows? And the other thing, though, is that motivation is what really kept me going throughout all of this. Like, really, in all honesty, the worst part about painting was whenever I had to apply the water slide transfers and I didn't record that because it was just annoying. It was absolutely annoying and not worth all the fiddly bits. Maybe I'll record, putting on a water slide decal video, or do it as for something that's an extremely big army, but I'm not going to do that for this time. Anyways, the other thing I would like to impart before ending all of this is just give you some words of encouragement. You're not going to be perfect the first time you do something. Initially, whenever I started painting this, I had a goal of getting it done in 5 days. I was going to begin on Monday and end on Sunday. And that didn't happen because my school schedule was such that it just was not feasible. And I was kind of tempted to scrap the project, but in the end I didn't, because I figured that this would be valuable to people who were just starting out. And honestly, like I've said before, something that I kind of get frustrated is that people decide to go and who are just starting out, go and just start comparing themselves to people who have been in the hobby for like half a decade. And if you've ever done any type of artistic project, the first couple of years, unless you're like a super prodigy, you're going to suck. That's just the reality of it. You're going to suck. You're going to crash and burn so many times, it's not going to be funny. But what keeps you going isn't that you suck, but the fact that you enjoy the process. That if you persist over time, you're going to get good at it. You're not going to be the same person you were last week. You're not going to be the same person you were last month. And you're not going to be the same person you were last year. Then there are two parts of getting better. The first part is continuing to do the action. The second part is to get criticism and critique of your work so you can go and learn from your mistakes and do better. And then there's a bonus part. Actually, yeah, so I lied. There are 3 parts. The third part is that you don't do it for other people. You do it for you. Before you go, don't forget to please like, comment, and subscribe. Anyways, this is Frontiers Horizon signing off, and until next time, stay frosty.